Imagine you're about to fly from New York to LA, and the trip ahead of you is 25 hours, 15 stops, and hopping between multiple planes. What you're imagining was the reality of air travelers before 1934. That time, flying was neither glamorous nor convenient. It was freezing in winter, boiling in summer, noisy, turbulent, and dangerously unreliable. Until one aircraft changed everything. The Douglas DC-3, a humble piston-engine aircraft that came even before the Boeing 707 and the de Havilland Comet, yet marked the beginning of mass air travel. With the DC-3, that same cross-country trip, now just 18 hours, 3 stops, and 1 comfortable, continuous flight. And it wasn't just a commercial success. In wartime, the DC-3 became the backbone of Allied air transport, delivering troops and supplies across every front. The reason behind this edge was its engines. They transformed the DC-3 from just another plane into a global aviation milestone. But one critical flaw almost grounded the whole fleet. And once you see how a phone call birthed the aircraft, you'll never look at the DC-3 the same way again. So if you're into aviation, innovation, or the machines that changed history, subscribe now, because this story is just taking off. Let's start with the beginning. In other words, the early 1930s, the era known as aviation's Wild West and the golden age of flight. Engineers were experimenting on everything they could get their hands on. We're talking flying boats, zeppelins, airships, and whatnot. Experimental planes were shaped like cigars, cigars with wings, wings without tails, tails without logic. If it flew, someone tried it. But one thing was clear: air travel was the future. And the airline that cracked long-distance, reliable passenger service first, that airline would win the world. Another notable thing of the early 1930s was the rivalry between United Airlines and American Airlines. United was betting on the Boeing 247, while American Airlines introduced the DC-2 as a competitor. Still, there was much room for improvement in the DC-2, and for them, this aging fleet wasn't cutting it anymore. They needed something faster, roomier, more efficient, and comfortable enough for passengers to want to fly. Finally, in 1934, American's CEO, C.R. Smith, picked up the phone and called Donald Douglas, head of the Douglas Aircraft Company. The call was simple: build us something better than the DC-2, something that can carry more people and still make money. Now, Douglas wasn't convinced. He didn't think there was a market big enough to justify building a new airplane from scratch. He even said no, but the pressure was mounting from both Boeing and a strange European design that had just started making headlines. Douglas knew that if he passed, it could be the end of his company's lead in civil aviation. So he said yes, but after securing a 20-aircraft purchase deal. Smart. Afterwards, that one call led to a rushed design sprint, a series of bold changes, and an airplane that would accidentally become one of the greatest machines ever built. But the DC-3 wasn't just a revamped DC-2. Its engine requirements forced Douglas to rethink everything, from the shape of the fuselage to the way weight was distributed across the wings. And behind closed doors, engineers were already worried. There was one limitation they couldn't solve. One they hoped no one would notice, until it nearly brought down a fully loaded aircraft. That part's coming. But first, let's talk about the engine. Because without the right power plant, the DC-3 would have just failed and never even left the drawing board. Designing the DC-3 wasn't just about adding more seats or stretching a DC-2. Well, these were among the requirements, but the real challenge was this: how do you power a bigger, heavier plane without killing range or reliability? In the 1930s, most aircraft engines were loud. They were also leaky and terrifyingly inconsistent. Think of it like trying to run a cross-country bus service. with engines that had the personality of a chainsaw and the lifespan of a matchstick. Douglas needed something different, something strong and dependable enough to cross thousands of miles day after day. So, multiple radial engines were considered. For example, the Wright R1820 Cyclone 9 and the Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp. But the Twin Wasp engine stood out in performance. Though it wasn't the most powerful, it did what needed to be done, better than all the others. And here's the genius of it. Radial engines like the Twin Wasp don't use liquid coolant like a car does. Instead, they use air flowing over the cylinders to stay cool. Less plumbing, fewer leaks, and less weight. It's like replacing your car's radiator with a wind tunnel. Less stuff to break and more room to go fast. With two of these engines, the DC-3 could cruise at 180 miles per hour and fly nearly 1,500 miles without refueling. And just as important, it could take off from shorter runways. That meant more airports, more routes, more flexibility. The engines gave the DC-3 its range, its speed, and its now legendary reliability. But they also introduced one major risk. The plane could only fly safely if both engines were working perfectly during takeoff. Lose one too early, and it was game over. No one talked about it in the brochures. But inside cockpits, pilots knew. Engine asymmetry wasn't a theory. It was a ghost that stalked every runway. Until an ingenious idea changed the rules entirely. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because, before the DC-3 ever dodged bullets or dropped soldiers, it did something even more radical. It made flying normal. Now, before the DC-3, commercial flying wasn't what it is today. People were afraid to board a plane and did it only out of absolute necessity. The cabins rattled, seats barely reclined. You couldn't hear your own thoughts over the engine noise. And worse, you couldn't trust the plane to reach its destination in one piece. The airlines, on the other hand, they were more about losing money than making it. But in 1936, that changed for the better. American Airlines put the first DC-3 into passenger service. Unlike its competitors, the DC-3 could make a profit, carrying only people. No mail subsidies. And that happened because it hit a sweet spot. This plane was just big enough to carry 21 passengers, but light and fuel-friendly enough to make the economics work. It was like the iPhone of its era. Not the first plane, but the first one that finally got everything right. All of it was possible because of the engines. They gave the airliner enough route flexibility, which meant no more stopping every 100 miles or relying on huge runways. Now flights could stretch across time zones in a single day. You see, the DC-3 was so good at doing its job that many other airlines wanted it for themselves. So the demand skyrocketed. Custom interiors, sleeper layouts, VIP variants. Suddenly, the plane was a canvas, and every airline wanted its own masterpiece. According to aviation author Henry M. Holden, passengers were treated like guests, served with duckling dinners on fine china, cocktails in hand, while the captain strolled the aisle mid-flight. Sleeper berths came with goose-down comforters. By 1940, more than 600 aircraft had been sold to multiple airlines. But success always comes at a price. Maintenance crews were stretched thin, spare parts were rationed, and one mistake could ground an entire route. And then came the moment no one expected. Washington called. Quietly, discreetly. War clouds were gathering overseas. They needed to know if this passenger plane could carry troops, gear, and stretch its wings into a combat zone. Behind the scenes, engineers were already sketching a militarized DC-3. Tougher, wider doors, reinforced floor. But they kept running into a strange limitation. Not in the structure, but inside the engine mounts. A problem no civilian had noticed yet. One that would only show itself when the aircraft was pushed to the edge. And by then, there would be no time left to fix it. Civilian success was one thing, but surviving war? That was another thing entirely. World War II had begun, and all hell had broken loose. But one thing about wars is that they aren't always fought with bombers, escorts, missiles, and interceptors. They need another equally important thing: cargo ships. So this time, Allied forces needed an airliner that could take a beating and still land intact. Short and rough airstrips and the strength of a workhorse. These were the expectations. Hence, the DC-3 was reborn as the C-47 Skytrain. This one was leaner and tougher than its commercial twin. It also had better landing gear and a big cargo door in the back. More than 15,000 were delivered to the Allies. It was so good that on D-Day alone, over 800 C-47s dropped more than 13,000 Allied soldiers behind enemy lines. No fighter jets, no escorts, just formation after formation of twin Wasps roaring over the English Channel. And not just troops. They carried ammo, fuel, and even jeeps into the battle zone. It was like the C-47 had the weight of victory on its shoulders. But that exact weight led to a serious problem. You see, all that cargo put serious strain on the engines, especially during takeoff. Remember earlier when we said both engines had to be near perfect synced to keep the aircraft flying? Well, the war exposed this flaw. Fuel from multiple sources, meaning varying quality. Rushed maintenance, overloaded takeoffs. This was war, and that meant no guarantee of anything. But they had to look for a solution, and a quick one. So the crews on the ground started getting creative. Instead of waiting for things to break, they made their own fixes. They adjusted the way fuel mixed with air in the engines to make them run more smoothly, especially under stress. Think of it like tuning a car so it doesn't stall in traffic. It wasn't factory approved, but it worked like a charm. And before every flight, they'd listen closely. No computers, no tools, just trained ears picking up small noises or tiny vibrations that warned them something's off. It was part skill, part gut feeling, and it saved lives. Still, not all dangers were mechanical. In Burma, pilots flew a brutal route over the Himalayas. It was infamously called the Hump. Freezing altitudes, no navigation, and weather so violent it bent wings mid-air. Yet somehow, the C-47s kept coming. Overloaded, exhausted, but flying. And they weren't just surviving. They were winning the war. But the story didn't end with World War II, because just when the DC-3 was supposed to retire, something stranger happened. Something that would put the engines through an entirely new kind of hell. It was 1950. The war had long ended. The DC-3s were already legends. However, it wasn't done, not even close. You see, it had another trick up its sleeve, one that would win the fleet decades of service. Surplus C-47s were sold off by the thousands. Airlines bought them cheap, stripped the camo, repainted the wings, and sent them right back into the sky. But how do you keep a plane from the 1930s flying into the jet age? The answer: reinvention. Airlines wanted faster, quieter, more efficient planes. Jet fuel was becoming the standard, and gasoline-powered piston engines were now outdated and hard to maintain. So Douglas called dibs and tried first. Sometime after the war, they unveiled the Super DC-3, a stretched, smoothed-out version with more powerful Wright R1820 engines. It had a redesigned tail and larger flaps. It could fly faster, carry more, and land softer. But here's the problem. It was too expensive, and airlines already had jets on the horizon. Hundreds were built and were mostly scooped up by the US Navy, which renamed them the R4D-8. Still, it planted a seed, because the next upgrade, it not only tweaked the plane, it transformed it entirely. From 1950 to 1960s, piston engines were becoming dinosaurs. Hard to source, harder to fix. Then came the game changer: Basler turbo conversions in Wisconsin. They took retired DC-3s and gave them new life. Ripping out the old pistons and dropping in turboprops, Pratt & Whitney PT6A67Rs. Think of it like giving a vintage Mustang an electric motor. Still classic, but now a beast under the hood. Turboprops don't need spark plugs. They compress air, mix it with fuel, and ignite it continuously. Like a jet engine spinning a propeller. Result? More thrust, less maintenance, and it runs on modern jet fuel. The new version, called the BT67, could go faster, farther, and higher. And when you add in digital avionics and an extended body, the DC-3 was thriving better than expectations. And Basler wasn't the only one in the game. Over the years, a handful of bold one-offs emerged. The Conroy Turbo 3 swapped in two Rolls-Royce Dart engines. The Conroy Tri-Turbo 3 added a third PT6 on the nose for extra power, and SAF conversions used Garrett TPE331S for hot and high operations in Africa. In total, almost 70 true turboprop conversions were made, and every single one pushed the airframe into new, sometimes extreme, missions. Ones the original designers never imagined. This should have been the end of the story. Jetliners now span oceans. Satellites guide planes with inch-perfect precision. The DC-3? It was supposed to be museum furniture. And yet, it flies. Not as nostalgia, not as a novelty, but as mission-critical hardware. In Colombia, it still hauls supplies into jungle villages. In Canada's far north, it lands on frozen lakes. In Antarctica, it delivers scientists to icy outposts. Why? Because no one has built a better combination of size, strength, simplicity, and soul. Its engines aren't the originals anymore, but the spirit is still there. They say modern jets fly by wire. The DC-3? It flies by will. It outlasted its designers. It outflew its competition. It even outlived some countries. So the next time you look up and hear the low rumble of propellers slicing the sky, don't dismiss it as just another old plane. You're hearing history. Still flying, still working, still winning. Have you ever seen a DC-3 in action? Share your story in the comments below.